Peppa walks into the garden and notices all flowers have turned to face her. The roses slowly turn their heads, watching every movement of the little pig carefully. Tulips begin whispering something unintelligible, their petals trembling from a strange wind blowing. Mummy Pig waters the flower bed, not noticing how plants reach toward her hands. Sunflowers turn not toward the sun, but toward the windows of the pig family house. George plays near bushes that slowly wrap their green shoots around his little legs. Daddy Pig reads his newspaper while lilies behind him lean closer and closer silently. Grandpa Pig waters carrots that grow incredibly fast right before his amazed old eyes. Daisies start counting their own petals, their voices sounding like a children's choir singing. Peppa tries to pick a flower, but it dodges away from her small hooves. All plants in the garden begin swaying in the same rhythm, as if dancing. Granny Pig comes out of the house and smiles at flowers that nod back. The grass under the family's feet becomes softer and starts glowing with greenish light. Violets by the porch open their petals, revealing tiny eyes hidden deep inside. Dahlias turn to each other and begin talking silently among themselves in whispers. Peppa notices that the shadow from the big oak moves against the sun's direction. All flowers in the garden simultaneously turn toward the house and freeze in silence. The pig family goes inside while plants continue watching through the bright windows. At night, flowers begin glowing and quietly humming a lullaby for the sleeping family. In the morning, the garden looks normal, but Peppa remembers yesterday's strange plant dance.
The morning in Peppa Pig's house began with an unusual silence. The sun barely penetrated the thick curtains, leaving the room in semi-darkness. George, usually sleeping on the bottom bunk, was motionless, and Peppa on top felt a strange numbness. Mummy Pig wasn't preparing breakfast. Daddy Pig wasn't reading the newspaper. The house was plunged into an unsettling quiet. Peppa came downstairs, her steps echoing in the empty hallway. She found her parents in the living room, sitting on the sofa, their gazes fixed on an old television broadcasting a strange show. Familiar faces of friends flashed across the screen. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, but all of them were dressed in green tracksuits, and their faces expressed not childish delight, but eerie concentration. Beside them stood figures in red jumpsuits with black masks resembling guards. One of them, tall and slender, with a circle on his mask, turned to the camera. His voice, distorted by the speakers, said,
"The game has begun."
Peppa tried to call her parents, but they didn't react. Their eyes were empty, and their faces were frozen in indifference. She ran to the television trying to turn it off, but the buttons didn't work. The image on the screen became brighter, and Peppa saw Susie Sheep, usually so cheerful, performing some task with a stone face. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and Susie disappeared. Only a green splatter remained in her place. Peppa recoiled in horror. She looked at her parents again. Their bodies trembled slightly in sync with what was happening on the screen, but their facial expressions remained unchanged. Suddenly, George appeared in the doorway. He was also dressed in a green suit, and his eyes were as black as the guards on the screen. "You're next," he whispered in a voice that wasn't George's. Peppa ran. She burst out of the house, but the world outside was just as alien and distorted. The sky was crimson, and the trees seemed twisted and dead. In the distance, she saw a giant doll, similar to the one in the show. Its head slowly turned, and Peppa heard a familiar melody. She ran without looking back, but knew there was no escape. Cold permeated her body, displacing fear.
The lost episode of Peppa Pig that never aired. A sunny day illuminated Peppa Pig's house, filling it with familiar laughter. Peppa and George played in their room, where a bunk bed stood against the wall, George on the bottom, Peppa on top. Mummy Pig cooked in the kitchen, and Daddy Pig read the newspaper in the living room. Everything was as usual, but a slight, barely perceptible tension hung in the air. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and Daddy Pig went to open it. Dr. Octopus stood on the threshold, his tentacles ominously writhing. His gaze was unusually empty, and his movements stiff. He didn't smile as he always did. Dr. Octopus entered, his steps heavy and slow. He surveyed the room, his eyes resting on Peppa and George. The children felt a chill run down their spines. Mummy Pig tried to speak to Dr. Octopus, but he only made a strange guttural sound. His tentacles began to move faster, casting an eerie shadow on the wall. Peppa and George hid under the bed, their hearts pounding. They heard strange sounds from the living room, sounds that shouldn't have been in their house. Daddy Pig tried to protect his family, but Dr. Octopus was too strong. His tentacles grabbed Daddy Pig and he vanished into the darkness. Mummy Pig screamed, her voice full of terror. She tried to run, but Dr. Octopus was faster. She too disappeared, leaving the children alone. Peppa and George trembled with fear, huddled together. They heard footsteps approaching their room. The door slowly opened, and a silhouette appeared in the doorway. It was Dr. Octopus, but now he looked different. His tentacles were longer, and his eyes glowed with an ominous red light. He extended his hand towards them. Peppa and George closed their eyes, awaiting their fate, but instead they felt a gentle touch. Dr. Octopus simply stroked their heads, his gaze full of sadness. Dr. Octopus slowly turned and left the room, leaving the children in silence. They didn't know what had happened, but they knew their lives would never be the same.
The morning at Peppa Pig's house began as usual. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and Mummy Pig was making breakfast. Peppa and George sat at the table happily eating pancakes. Daddy Pig read the newspaper, snorting with satisfaction. Everything was peaceful, just like always. But something was different that day. George, normally cheerful and loud, was unusually quiet. He didn't ask for seconds, didn't laugh at Daddy Pig's jokes, and ignored his favorite toy, Dinosaur. Mummy Pig noticed first. "George, dear, are you all right?" she asked. He only nodded. His eyes were blank, and his smile looked painted on. Peppa tried to play with him, but he turned away, staring at nothing. At the playground, where laughter usually echoed, George stayed alone. He didn't run with Pedro Pony or jump in puddles with Rebecca Rabbit. His friends, Susie Sheep and others, tried to include him, but he just waved them off like he couldn't hear them. As days passed, George became worse. He avoided people, moved stiffly, and spoke in a flat tone. He stopped playing, drawing, or watching cartoons. The only thing that interested him was an old, worn book he found in the attic. He spent hours flipping through its pages, though it had no text or pictures, only strange symbols and patterns. Peppa tried to peek, but George clutched it tightly. His eyes were cold and distant, with no trace of his usual sparkle. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Peppa heard strange noises from George's room. Not crying or laughter, something between a whisper and a rustle. She crept to the door and opened it slightly. George was sitting on the lower bunk, and above him, his dinosaur toy hung, gently swaying as if alive. George murmured to the book, his body trembling slightly. A strange smell filled the room, like old paper mixed with something Peppa couldn't place. A chill ran down her spine. She didn't know what was happening to her brother. The next morning, George was gone. His bed was empty, and the book lay open on the floor. On one page was a drawing that hadn't been there before, a silhouette of a piglet dissolving into the strange symbols. Peppa called Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, but they only shrugged, thinking George was playing hide and seek. But Peppa knew better. Something had changed. The world felt wrong. Familiar sounds now seemed eerie. She stared at George's empty bed. her eyes full of something deeper than childish fear. Something had taken her brother. She didn't know if he'd ever return. And the scariest part, she began to notice how the shadows in the house grew longer and the whispers became clearer.